My name is David Goodman. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event titled There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, featuring Dr. Brian Goldstone and two esteemed respondents from Loyola Marymount University. I'm going to introduce each momentarily, but I want to frame the event a little bit for you. So we're here on Loyola Marymount's campus, have a lovely audience right here. And also we're streaming this via Zoom to a national audience. There's quite a few people signed up for this, so you're not alone in the room. Happy to have all of you joining us tonight. And by the way, Brian's mom and dad are on as well. Hi, Deb and Mike, wherever you are in the world. So after a few of my own opening remarks, I'm going to hand it along to Dr. Goldstone, and then we'll hear from the respondents and hopefully with enough time have some Q&A as well. But this event is more than meets the eye. It's a part of a larger initiative, and Dean Fox was speaking of it. And it's these 6 Jesuit schools coming together, trying to bring psychology, philosophy, and theology into deeper conversation with one another in order to enhance our capacity to be responsive to significant social issues that face us. I mean, that's what we've been doing with one another. We've been going to each of our respective campuses, and now it's LMU's turn. So we're here. And we're here for the next couple days. Tonight's talk is actually the launch of this convening that will take us tomorrow to Catholic Worker House, to Homeboy Industry, to Homegirl Industries, where we really get to think and see together in this very consequential and intense time, face one of the largest, most vexing issues that we are seeing as a nation, and that is homelessness. Less than 2 weeks ago, a Los Angeles Times article piece was published that has actually been generating a significant amount of chatter. A report that's now circulating in the LA City Hall provided certain findings and an estimate of what it would take to, quote, get every person living on the street today indoors and make sure that no one languished there for years again, end quote. Which, by the way, after tonight's talk, I think you'll actually see maybe that's not the best metric living on the street to understand the scope and gravity of this problem. There's a scale far beyond that. But in this article, the figure that's given is $21.7 billion in the next decade is what it would take in order to, quote, fix this problem. The remainder of the article spends a good amount of time addressing the sticker shock of that figure and also various people's reaction to that and how unrealistic it would be. Last night, I was at an event at USC, and the article actually came up. It was a very quick conversation. $22 billion. This issue is just so big. It's actually very hard to know even what we can do. Then the hors d'oeuvres got passed, end of the conversation. Paralysis set in, and I'm guilty of this as well. The complexity of the topic at hand is simply mind-boggling, but it shouldn't and can't shut us down. This is where human creativity and ingenuity and even sacrifice must prevail. So I look forward to seeking a deeper understanding with all of you tonight. And I'm very grateful to Brian Goldstone for being willing to walk us into this space so that we can think about how to take it up. It's very rare one has the opportunity to actually introduce a dear friend. Brian and I grew up together in neighboring cities in the San Fernando Valley. We went to school together, and our families were interlaced in many ways in those early years. His parents were like second parents to me. And yes, Deb, I am saying that, knowing that you're on Zoom, probably crying right now. And yet I think you would agree, Brian, that we were very different human beings and had divergent interests in almost every way. We were friends, I would say, because our families were friends and we were in the same little league. Then life happened and our paths split quite a bit, almost entirely, and we lost touch. And it was only years later that I came to find out that Brian was studying at Duke to get his PhD in anthropology, and I was interested, and I can't remember exactly how we reconnected, but when we did, it was as though I had found a long-lost brother. Our interests and concerns were so kindred, and I found myself shocked by how much I utterly liked Brian and enjoyed him. Since then, our families have actually grown quite close, and I look for any excuse to be in orbit with Brian and to have more proximity with one another. And I attribute all of his characterological growth to the fact that Elaine, his partner, is the person he married, and she's here with us tonight. And Elliot and Emmett as well, his children, are here with us joining. And Elaine made him a better person, and it's a good thing. So It's been wonderful. But all joking aside, Brian's work, as you'll see tonight, is haunting, powerful, human, and alive. The issues and ideas he's tackling are our human issues, and he is not afraid to enter them in all their depth and to ensure that he keeps human voices at the fore. His journalism has won him grants and fellowships from Fulbright, the Wenner Gren Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. He has been published in the most culturally impactful outlets, including Harper's Magazine and the New Republic, and I could go on and on. But tonight we're here to hear more about his forthcoming book from Crown, coming out in spring 2025, advance copy. There is no place for us working and homeless in America. Let me quickly introduce his respondents, and then I'll hand the mic over. Our first respondent will be Eric Martin, and he is a lecturer here in theological studies at LMU. He holds his PhD in theology from Fordham and an MTS from Boston College. And his research focuses on religious economics in the 1930s in Los Angeles, the Bible's role in justice movements, and global liberation theologies, with a special interest in religious fascisms and anti-fascisms. The next respondent will be Jennifer Owens Joffrey, an assistant professor in the theology studies department here as well. She's a Catholic theologian and a lay ecclesial minister, and her focus is primarily around the voices of Latina women as a theological source and practical theological methods. Delighted to be hosting all of your voices tonight. And so with no further ado, Brian.
Thank you, David. What a tremendous gift to be here with you all tonight and to be introduced by my dear friend. It is unusual to, even before one begins a talk, to be choked up and caught off guard by the generosity and graciousness of an introduction. But thank you so much, David. And tonight is especially meaningful for me because after working on this book for the last 5 years or so, this is the first opportunity I have to speak about it publicly. So I'm very, very honored and grateful for the invitation to be here. So in the fall of 2018, when I first met Kokethia and her kids, the family had already been homeless for about 3 months. Their protracted nightmare began after the house they had been renting in a gentrifying neighborhood of Atlanta was sold to an investor, and their lease was abruptly terminated. They couldn't afford anything in the same neighborhood, so they moved to a different rental on the outer reaches of the city. But then that house was soon condemned, and before they knew it, the family had nowhere else to go. When Kokethia shared the story with me, I could tell that she was still in a state of shock. It wasn't just the circumstances that had deprived her family of housing. It was the fact that they had become homeless despite her full-time job as a home health aide. And she returned to this point again and again as if she couldn't quite wrap her mind around it. Like many of us, she had been taught to believe that homelessness and a job are mutually exclusive. That if she worked hard enough and stayed on top of her responsibilities, if she just clocked enough hours, she might not make it rich, but she would at least find a modicum of stability. And yet here she was wearing her bright blue medical scrubs and checking her phone every few minutes to see if any shelter beds had opened up. I grew up in this city, she told me. Through my job, I've been taking care of men and women in this city. And now me and my kids are homeless? How does that even happen? I ended up writing about Kokethia and her children in a magazine article for the New Republic. But after I finished it, their story wouldn't let me go. And as I kept reporting on housing and homelessness across the country, I started seeing the same phenomenon pretty much everywhere. In Northern California, I saw safe parking lots full of workers living in their cars and minivans. At a street encampment in Georgia, I met a woman who lived in a tent and every morning used a hose next to a Chick-fil-A dumpster to bathe herself. and then she got dressed and went to work at a call center. I met people who had worked their entire lives and were now disabled and unhoused because their disability checks didn't come close to covering housing costs. I met gig workers who did airport runs for Uber and Lyft during the day and then slept in that same car at night, using gym memberships to shower. And it wasn't long before I met the 5 families whose desperate struggle to secure stable housing I've sought to document in this book. The book is based in Atlanta, and it follows these families over a period of about 2 years. Drawing on my training as an anthropologist, I basically tried to immerse myself in their day-to-day lives, spending as much time with them as I possibly could. I went with them to work and to family gatherings. I went with them to meet with caseworkers and service providers and child welfare investigators. I stood in line with them at food pantries, and I attended birthday parties and Christmas Eve dinners. This methodology was really crucial because it seemed important to show people in the fullness of who they are and what they aspire to be, not just capturing them in their most anguished and difficult moments, as so much reporting and academic research on poverty tends to do. And what I hope people who read this book walk away with, what I hope they walk away with is a visceral sense of what it looks and feels like for parents, for their kids, when one of the most basic human necessities, the need for housing, is always just out of reach. Just like Kokethia, what each of these families in the book are forced to confront ultimately is the reality that in America today, having a full-time job, even 2 or 3 jobs, is no guarantee that you'll be able to afford a place to live. The phrase working homeless seems counterintuitive. There's something scandalous about the idea that these 2 words, working and homeless, could even go together. And part of why it's so jarring is because it exposes the cracks in our prevailing narratives about hard work and homelessness alike. Yet my book argues that in many ways, this is becoming the new face of homelessness in the US. People whose paychecks are simply not enough to keep a roof over their heads. When I've talked about this with friends and family and other people over the years, I often get a response like, okay, sure, there might be a couple of unhoused people with jobs here and there, but surely they're the exception to the rule. But that's not the case at all. A recent study by scholars at Yale, UPenn, and the University of Chicago shows that roughly half of America's sheltered homeless population and about 40% of the unsheltered population have formal employment. There are a couple of statistics that very succinctly show why we're seeing this staggering rise of the working homeless. Here's the first one. Today, there isn't a single state, city, or county in the US where a full-time worker earning the local minimum wage, which is, as in California, often higher than the federal minimum wage, where they can afford a median-priced 2-bedroom apartment. Let that sink in. Right now, there are nearly 12 million low-income households who are classified as severely cost-burdened, spending on average an astonishing 78% of their earnings on rent and utilities alone. For years, by the way, the conventional wisdom among economists and others has been that people should be spending no more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. Anything beyond that is considered unaffordable. And you might think that this problem would be most acute in poorer areas of the country, but the opposite is actually true. It's in the nation's richest, most rapidly developing cities, the ones doing well, that the threat of homelessness has become most dire. It's not just New York or San Francisco or LA. It's Austin and Phoenix, Denver and Nashville, Washington, DC, and Seattle. In all these cities, we see a similar pattern. Unemployment is low. The signs of growth are everywhere. And yet the delivery drivers, daycare workers, supermarket cashiers, and even teachers and social workers are being relentlessly priced out of them and increasingly out of housing altogether. And one of the perverse and really paradoxical dynamics I point to in the book is that what we're seeing today is a crisis born less of poverty than of prosperity. It's wrong to say, and this drives me nuts when people say this, that families and all these people are falling into homelessness. They are being pushed. They're the casualties, not of a failing economy, but a thriving economy. And in this sense, Atlanta, where I live with my family, is definitely a case in point. There's a lot that's unique about Atlanta, including the fact, when it comes to housing, that it was the first city in America to build public housing and the first city in the 90s to demolish all of its public housing. But a big reason why the book is based there is because of how representative it is. Over the last 2 decades, the city has undergone a much celebrated renaissance in its urban core, what used to be called the inner city. With the Atlanta Beltline, a multi-billion-dollar mega project hailed as one of the most ambitious redevelopment projects in the nation, standing as the ultimate signifier of this new Atlanta. But during the same time period, median rents in Atlanta have soared by 76%, and the city has lost more than 60,000 affordable housing units. In other words, just like in those other cities I mentioned, that interplay of growth and displacement, development and deprivation is very much happening in Atlanta too. In all these places, a low-wage job is homelessness waiting to happen. The slightest setback or unexpected expense, minor car trouble, disrupted childcare, a brief illness can be disastrous. And this really comes down to the growing chasm between what landlords are charging for a place to live and what our country's workers are being paid. Since 1985, rent prices nationwide have exceeded income gains by, get this, 325%. An organization called the National Low Income Housing Coalition calculates every year what they call the housing wage needed to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment in any given city. In Atlanta, the housing wage is currently $29.87 an hour. But in Georgia, including Atlanta, the minimum wage, which is also the federal minimum wage, is $7.25 an hour. $29.87 an hour, the housing wage, $7.25 an hour, the minimum wage. In Boston, a renter earning the local minimum wage would have to log 141 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom. Here in LA, the housing wage is now $47.92 an hour, which means that someone making minimum wage would have to work 3 full-time jobs to afford a 2-bedroom. And if you're disabled and receive SSI, it's even worse. SSI payments are currently capped at $943 a month nationwide. And there is nowhere in the country where this form of fixed income is enough to afford the average rent. I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed over the last several years who, as they've confronted this bleak arithmetic of stagnant incomes and out of control housing and utility costs, have cut back wherever they can. But eventually there's nothing left to cut. And then they find themselves living in this kind of shadow realm, languishing in their cars, the overcrowded apartments of others, and in hyper-exploitative extended stay hotels and rooming houses. By shadow realm, I mean that these families and individuals don't have homes, but by and large, they're not officially counted or recognized in our public discourse as homeless. Driving around cities like LA, we can see the encampments, but those are actually just the most visible manifestations of a far more pervasive problem. The tents are just the tip of the iceberg. And in many ways, to continue with this iceberg metaphor, my book is about everything that's beneath the water surface, what we're not seeing. Even as I argue that all of this, the encampments, the hotels, the cars, all of it is just one big iceberg, a whole spectrum of insecurity. So, as I mentioned earlier, the book follows 5 families, and each of them, with their unique backgrounds and circumstances, illuminate a particular aspect of this larger phenomenon. But tonight I want to tell you about one family in particular, the Walker family, Celeste and her 3 kids. Celeste is a 46-year-old woman who grew up in Florida and has now lived in Atlanta for many years. Confident and super smart, she's a person of 1,000 talents. In another life, she could have been a CEO. She prides herself on being competent and industrious, and she seems to know everything about everything, as I've experienced firsthand when I've tried to. Um, she's charismatic, she has a great sense of humor, and she carries herself with an air of invincibility. Like whatever challenges are thrown her way, she's going to figure out a way not just to get past them, but to thrive. But on an afternoon in May 2018, a chain of events began that would prove insurmountable even for her. That was the day she received a frantic phone call from her next door neighbor saying that her house was on fire. She had just picked up the kids from school after leaving her warehouse job, and by the time the 4 of them made it back to Westover Drive, to the rental home that they'd lived in for over a year, it had been completely destroyed. The firefighters wouldn't even allow them inside to retrieve any belongings, but it didn't matter because everything was ruined either by the fire or by the fire hoses. Their only possessions were what the kids had taken to school with them in their backpacks and a couple of hampers of dirty laundry that Celeste had thrown in her car earlier that morning, intending to go to the laundromat after work. Soon, a volunteer from the Red Cross arrived and gave Celeste a prepaid debit card to cover food and toiletries and a few nights at the Howard Johnson near the airport. Investigators later determined that the fire had been started by a man Celeste had broken up with a few months earlier, who she had recently taken a restraining order out on for harassment and stalking. He was arrested for arson later that week. While the family was still reeling from this tragedy, Celeste started looking for a new place to live. At first, she was confident that they'd be able to rent an apartment relatively quickly. But after a couple of days of driving around the city and scouring listings on Zillow and apartments.com, this optimism evaporated. The rents landlords were now charging were outrageous. The home that Celeste and her kids had been renting was far from perfect, but at least she'd been able to afford it. Now, confronted with Atlanta's increasingly cutthroat rental market, she felt like the ground had shifted under her feet. Neighborhoods that were once affordable for low-wage workers like herself were becoming revitalized, pushing housing costs up and poorer residents out. But it wasn't just skyrocketing rents. It was also the issue of simply applying for an apartment. Atlanta's competitive rental market had enabled landlords not only to raise rents, but to tack on exorbitant application and administrative fees, which had to be paid upfront and were non-refundable even if your application was rejected. Celeste was aghast at what some of the properties were charging. One complex was demanding an admin fee, and I saw this with my own eyes because I was like, there's no way this is real. One complex was demanding an admin fee of $200 in addition to $75 for the application itself, meaning it would cost Celeste $275 just to apply for this one apartment with no guarantee of being approved, non-refundable. Given her limited savings, like 44% of Americans, she had less than $1,000 set aside for an emergency. She needed to be very selective in which apartment she applied for. The idea of casting a wide net was obviously out of the question. Meanwhile, the Red Cross funds ran out, and since she couldn't afford the nightly rent at the the nightly rate at the Howard Johnson, she began asking every friend and relative she had in the city to allow her and the kids to sleep on their floor or on a couch or in their basement. And so that summer, as May turned to June and June turned to July, they bounced around from place to place, occasionally sleeping in her Dodge Durango when they had nowhere else to stay. These nights were really horrible for Celeste because she worried that the police would find her and the kids asleep in the vehicle and call Child Protective Services. And actually, this fear was quite legitimate. Approximately 20% of child removals in Georgia are because of, quote, inadequate housing. Sometimes during these long, uncomfortable nights in the car or on someone's floor, Celeste and the kids would watch videos on her phone, taken at the home they no longer had. There was the video of 7-year-old Micah, who Celeste called her big teddy bear, which he hated, getting his treasured Spider-Man pajamas on Christmas morning, or the video of 14-year-old Jalen smiling his big electric smile after performing the rap song he'd just written, or the one of 16-year-old Naya cuddled with her brothers on the living room couch. It was hard for Celeste to believe that the life she had built for the four of them, the stability they'd found, had so quickly disappeared. And then, after 3 months of all this, Celeste finally came across an apartment listing that seemed promising. The friendly leasing agent told her she could move in as soon as they were approved. So she filled out the application and paid the fees. Then she prayed. A few days later, she was shocked when the same agent called her back to say she had been denied. "Why didn't you tell me about the recent eviction on your record?" he asked, clearly annoyed. Celeste said that was a mistake. There hadn't been any eviction. But it turned out she was wrong. Later, she pieced together what had happened. Back in May, when her house burned down, she had reached out to her landlord, which happened to be a big real estate investment management and private equity firm called the Prager Group. The company's portfolio included roughly 3,000 rental properties worth over $350 million. Celeste asked them, after the fire, if she could move into a different rental home, and they told her that in order to break her lease at the burned down property, she would first have to pay not only the current month's rent, the fire had happened right at the beginning of the month before she paid her rent for that month, but an additional month's rent as well. And that was in addition to the rent she would have to pay at the new property. Celeste hung up in disgust, and she thought that was the end of it. What she didn't find out until later, after getting rejected by the leasing agent, was that the Prager Group had actually gone and filed an eviction against her for refusing to pay those 2 months of rent. She drove to her old house on Westover Drive, which still hadn't been repaired and was sitting vacant. And inside the mailbox, she found an eviction notice from a couple of months earlier. The sheriff who had left the notice in her mailbox wrote at the bottom of the form that it was, and I quote, served to fire damaged property. Celeste drove to the courthouse where a clerk told her that when she had failed to file a response to the eviction notice within 7 days, a default judgment had been handed down against her. So Celeste had been evicted without her knowledge from a home that had been destroyed. This was crushing news for her because she knew that in the long run, the eviction on her record could actually prove more devastating than the fire itself. And indeed, this stain on her rental history, this scarlet E, as people call it, would continue to haunt her for years to come. And this really speaks to a key component of our housing and homelessness crisis, which is the extraordinary power asymmetry between landlords and tenants. Not only did Celeste not have to be notified of the eviction in person, but in Georgia, a landlord could demand rent even if the property was not fit for human habitation. There was no law requiring landlords to certify the habitability of their properties. So while the circumstances that started all this for Celeste was, of course, very dramatic and unique, her ex burning down her home, she was actually like millions of other low-income renters in this country, in that her descent into homelessness was rooted in a fundamental lack of tenant rights and protections. At this point, Celeste felt like she had hit rock bottom. She had exhausted her list of friends and contacts willing to let her and the kids stay with them. And while Celeste initially had an impulse to fight the Prager group and maybe hire a lawyer, she knew she had to focus on her more pressing needs, continuing to hold down her warehouse job, and above all, putting a roof over her family's head. Realizing that now she wouldn't be able to get approved for any apartment anywhere because of this eviction on her record, she did what countless families deprived of housing are increasingly doing. She decided to go to an extended stay hotel. Now, let me just step back for a moment and tell you about the world of extended stays. You might be more familiar with the high-end versions of extended stay hotels, places like Residence Inn and Homewood Suites, where business professionals or traveling healthcare workers might stay. But there's this whole world of long stay hotels and motels at the economy or budget end of the spectrum, and these places have proliferated in recent years. These are places where people go when they've been pushed out of the formal housing market, where you don't need good credit to stay there, where you pay your rent by the week, and where all the stuff you might associate with this kind of hotel, like laundry facilities or even free Wi-Fi, are virtually non-existent. And this model has turned out to be extremely profitable for those who own these establishments. In fact, after Extended Stay America, which is the largest chain of budget extended stays in the country, brought in revenues of over $1 billion in 2020. And this was during the pandemic when all regular hotels were pretty much empty. The chain was purchased by the private equity giants Blackstone and Starwood Capital. So here we have Wall Street investors and private equity firms not only buying up vast swaths of the nation's rental properties like the one Celeste had been living in, but they're also cornering the market on the places where people go once people lose their housing. In other words, what we're seeing is a flood of investment capital seeking to profit off the very crisis that these investors helped to create. The extended stays aren't simply filling a gap amid the nation's affordable housing shortage. They are actively exploiting and in many ways exacerbating that gap as a business model. And something that really struck me as I researched this trend is the direct correlation between the degree of housing insecurity in a particular city and the number of extended stay hotels that are materializing within it. These tend to be cities with especially red-hot rental markets, almost as if the people flocking to these places of last resort are the economic casualties of their city's success. They're often clustered in the urban and increasingly suburban peripheries. That's certainly true of Efficiency Lodge, where Celeste and her kids found themselves because it was the cheapest option around. Even though at almost $300 a week, it was more expensive than the 3-bedroom house she had been renting. Efficiency Lodge sits on a notorious 3.5-mile stretch of Candler Road next to the interstate. This is a long, pockmarked thoroughfare comprising block after block of dialysis clinics, liquor stores, pawn shops, payday lenders, plasma donation centers, 24-hour daycares, and a remarkable array of nearly identical ramshackle extended stays. This is an area that's been hollowed out by what the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore refers to as organized abandonment. And it's where people often end up after being pushed out of Atlanta's gentrifying neighborhoods. Areas like this don't simply coexist alongside newly or soon to be redeveloped parts of the city. They are actively generated by these gentrifying areas. Although they seem worlds apart, these two kinds of neighborhoods are actually intimately connected, like a balloon squeezed at one end. During their first several weeks at Efficiency, Celeste and the kids actually felt like it was a kind of refuge. They no longer had to worry about where they would be staying from one night to the next. And even though the 4 of them were crammed into a tiny 300 square foot room with Celeste and Micah in the bed and Jalen and Naya on the filthy, threadbare carpet. They tried to make the best of it. In fact, Celeste had always dreamed of opening her own restaurant. She even had a name for it, Passion Foods. And when she saw that the hotel was located in a food desert with no grocery stores and only fast food places nearby, she started operating a makeshift restaurant out of her room on days she wasn't working at the warehouse or after she got back at the end of a shift. Armed just with her trusty crock pot, a microwave, and her kitchenette's grease-encrusted stove, Celeste charged $10 for a large serving of whatever she happened to be preparing that day. Shrimp fettuccine, fully loaded nachos, turkey chili, and her specialty, which I tried, it's very good, smashed potatoes with a side of salmon. Her neighbors at the hotel began lining up to get a plate of food every day before it sold out. Celeste had no intention of staying at Efficiency longer than a month or two. Her plan was to take any extra money she was able to make through working overtime hours or selling food and put it toward paying down her eviction debt. It was only by paying off this debt, she reasoned, that she would have any chance at all of getting the eviction taken off her record and potentially getting approved for an apartment. But this plan was derailed by yet another catastrophic turn. She started experiencing an array of vague but persistent physical symptoms, strange pains in her abdomen, pelvis, and lower back, loss of appetite, discomfort while urinating. After a number of emergency room visits that yielded no clear sense of what was going on, she was referred finally to a specialist who determined, after ordering a battery of tests, that she had ovarian and breast cancer. The doctor said she needed to immediately start treatment, and over the coming weeks, as she underwent what was expected to be at least 4 months of chemo, she spent many sleepless nights hunched over her toilet, vomiting from intense nausea. Then she cleaned herself up and went to work. Her body was screaming at her to stay put, rest, but like many people in our new labor economy, but like many jobs in our new labor economy, her employer offered no paid sick leave, and she knew she couldn't afford to miss even one paycheck. It was during this period of sickness that she started to see the hotel in a very different light. Whenever she and other residents complained about a broken air conditioner or a leaking ceiling or rodents or rampant mold, the response was always a version of, well, there are plenty of others who will gladly take your place. Available rooms at Efficiency, like at the other hotels in its vicinity, were exceedingly scarce, and management wielded this fact like a weapon. If one family left because they refused to put up with the conditions any longer, there were always 3 or 4 other families waiting to rent their room. So there was no incentive for management to make life at the hotel more bearable for residents. This too was a business model that preyed on the desperation of those who had nowhere else to turn. For Celeste, the hotel was no longer a refuge. It had come to feel like an expensive prison. Many residents used the phrase hotel trap to describe this predicament. With no other options, they're caught in a semi-permanent state of limbo. Their squalid room often devours the entirety of their income, making it impossible to save enough money for a security deposit and first month's rent at a real apartment. Every morning, school buses arrive at Efficiency and the other hotels lining Candler Road to pick up the many children who have lived there not for months, but for years. I met people at Efficiency who had been there so long that the hotel address was on their driver's license. Nobody wanted to be there long term, but they knew the alternative, if they failed to pay their weekly rent and got locked out of their room immediately, was even worse. Sleeping in their car, if they had a car, on someone's floor, at an emergency shelter, or even on the street. In this respect, the only thing scarier than being stuck at a place like Efficiency was not being able to remain there. Celeste often thought about the hotel motto she'd seen behind the manager's desk when she first checked in. The sign read, "Stay a night or stay forever." Now this motto seemed less like an invitation than a threat. So now, with her sickness, Celeste realized that her plan of paying off her eviction debt and getting into an apartment on her own was impossibly out of reach. At one point, before the diagnosis, Celeste had discussed her situation with a social worker at Micah's elementary school, and the woman had given Celeste a homeless resource list and suggested she reach out to these organizations. Celeste had resisted going that route, not just because she found it hard to accept that the word homeless could apply to her own family situation, but because she was averse to asking anyone for help. But this resistance had now vanished. Her fear of getting trapped indefinitely at Efficiency Lodge outweighed the embarrassment of pleading for outside support. Pride and dignity, she realized, were luxuries she could no longer afford. So one day she fished out the piece of paper and one by one dialed the numbers. And the refrain she heard over and over again was that before she could receive any kind of housing assistance, she first had to go to a place called Gateway Center, which was the primary hub for homeless services in Atlanta. Most cities have their own version of Gateway. And this is because years ago, HUD decided that every city and county receiving federal funds needed to set up what's called a coordinated entry system to streamline the provision of services among local agencies and nonprofits. So Gateway really was that, a gateway to getting help. That is, if any resources were even available. When Celeste mentioned to her neighbor Christina, who had been living at Efficiency with her children for over 4 years, that she was planning on going to Gateway, Christina scoffed at the idea. Good luck with that, she'd said. She herself had tried unsuccessfully to get help there. And although Celeste didn't say this to Christina, what she thought was, yeah, well, you're not me. She was convinced that if anyone could navigate this system, it was her. A few days later, Celeste woke up at 4:30 in the morning in order to be at Gateway before the sun rose. She'd been told that since intake interviews were conducted on a first come, first served basis, people often began lining up in the middle of the night. Still, when she arrived downtown before dawn, she was shocked to find that a long line of men and women and kids was already sneaking down the sidewalk outside the building. As she stood waiting and shivering in line, she was overcome with nausea, but she forced herself to stick it out, clutching a manila folder filled with all the documents she imagined she would need: hotel receipts, a police report from the arson, pay stubs, birth certificates. Finally, after waiting more than 4 hours, Celeste was ushered through Gateway's airport-style metal detector and was soon led to a bare, windowless office where her assessment would be conducted. She put her stack of documents on the desk and then launched into the story of how she and her kids had ended up without a home, which she had been rehearsing in her head all morning. But she didn't get very far before the caseworker, a woman in her 30s, politely cut her off. The woman explained that the purpose of this interview was to ask Celeste a series of questions, a standardized assessment that anyone seeking assistance at Gateway, and really anyone seeking homeless services anywhere in the country, first needed to undergo. Celeste was perplexed by the questions she was then asked. Had she ever been diagnosed with a behavioral health disorder? What about HIV or AIDS? Since becoming homeless, had she been arrested or tried to harm herself or been physically abused? How often did she drink or use drugs? Did she ever exchange sex for money or share needles with others? No, 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 Celeste answered. She was growing frustrated at not being able to share her story, and she tried to interject with important details, such as her cancer diagnosis and the unjust eviction on her record. She told the woman how depressed, even hopeless, she had started to feel, and how scared she was for her kids. I can see the toll all this is taking on them, she said. But her words seemed to have no effect. The assessment was over in a matter of minutes. The caseworker looked up and sighed. The purpose of all these questions, she said, was to figure out who most urgently needed help. And based on the answer Celeste had provided, her vulnerability score, as the caseworker called it, would be very low, too low to qualify for housing support. What about my cancer? Celeste said. Doesn't that count for anything? She said this even though it felt incredibly degrading to have to instrumentalize her diagnosis in this way. The caseworker said that yes, this was indeed awful, but the biggest obstacle was that Celeste and her children did not fit the criteria for literal homelessness as determined by HUD. In order to get housing aid, Celeste had to be considered literally homeless, which meant being in a shelter or on the street. The caseworker said that other circumstances, unfortunately, just didn't qualify. And I want to linger at this scene for a moment because what was playing out here is absolutely crucial to how we understand homelessness in America. Even though research over the last few decades has unequivocally shown that the way most people in this country, especially families with kids, experience homelessness is by living doubled or tripled up in crowded apartments with others, or living in their cars, or in extended stay hotel rooms. HUD's definition has effectively ignored this fact. And this has had huge consequences because how homelessness is defined doesn't just determine whether or not families like Celeste's have access to vital resources. It also shapes our sense of the magnitude and breadth and nature of homelessness in this country. And that, in turn, affects our understanding of what truly meaningfully addressing this problem ought to look like. Before something can be counted, it has to be defined. And one way this country has managed to reduce homelessness is by defining entire segments of America's homeless population out of existence. Now, this exclusion was actually by design. In the early 80s, when mass homelessness was erupting during the Reagan presidency, there was a concerted attempt by his administration to shape the public perception of this crisis. At first, they actually tried to deny that there was any problem at all. But when these efforts at gaslighting the public failed, people just had to look outside. There was a shift to downplaying the severity of the crisis while muddying its root causes. Officials realized that the narrative needed to be controlled. Otherwise, it could be politically disastrous. It could lead people to conclude that this humanitarian catastrophe, for that's really what it was due to structural issues like the decimation of the social safety net, or the legacy of racism, or the growing precariousness of low-wage work, or the fact that the nation's budget for low-income housing had just been slashed. And so very quickly, individual pathology became the dominant frame for understanding homelessness. In fact, federal funding for social science research on this issue was limited exclusively to work that foregrounded mental illness and addiction to the neglect of other factors. There was actually an article in Life magazine, I believe at that time, and the headline was Reagan versus the Social Sciences. One brilliant article by a historian of public health published a few years ago refers to this as a lopsided research agenda, one that led both academics and policymakers to focus disproportionately on a small sliver of the total homeless population. Now, to be clear, then as now, nobody denied that some of the men and women who were most visibly suffering on the streets were struggling with mental health issues or addiction or other disabilities. But these conditions on their own had not caused them to be deprived of housing. any more than a fever causes the flu. Yet a medicalized homelessness was deemed less threatening to the social and economic status quo than a politicized one. In this effort to shape public discourse, it was actually really successful. In the late 80s, the New York Times surveyed people at random, asking them what they thought caused homelessness. Most said it was caused by alcohol, drugs, or psychological problems. Others said an unwillingness to work. Nobody mentioned housing. Meanwhile, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population were children under the age of 6. Over the next 2 decades, homelessness came to be seen as tragic but unremarkable, a seemingly permanent fixture of the cityscape. Fixated on the individual, it became the purview of churches and nonprofits, more a question of charity than of injustice. At the same time, the interests of advocates and government officials began to converge on a definition of homelessness that was deliberately narrow and circumscribed. For advocates, this was a matter of moral urgency. They had to ensure that scarce resources were targeted at those considered in most immediate need of help. For political leaders, it was a matter of expediency. The more contained the problem, the easier it was to tackle, or at least to claim it was being tackled. By 2005, when the point-in-time count, the annual homeless census, was established by HUD, a small but conspicuous fraction of the total homeless population had come to stand in the public imagination for homelessness itself. Everyone else was written out of the story. They literally did not count. And over the last few years, through independent research, we've been able to get a glimpse into just how vast the chasm is between the official number that makes it into newspaper headlines. And in places like Georgia, those headlines have said over the last several years, homelessness is down, homelessness is down. So we've been able to get a sense of how vast the chasm is between the number that makes it into those headlines and the actual number of people experiencing homelessness in this country. We're talking a population of unhoused people that's approximately 6 times that of the official HUD figure. In Atlanta, if all of the men, women, and children overlooked by the official census were to gather at the stadium where the Braves play, they could fill the stadium nearly 3 times over. Just those excluded from the official count. And this brings us back to Celeste sitting in that office at Gateway, being told, in effect, that she wasn't homeless in the right way, being told she and the kids weren't vulnerable enough. A big argument in my book is that we need to widen the lens, seeing homelessness not as a fixed state or a static condition, but as a point along an entire continuum of insecurity. And this changes not just our sense of the experiential and phenomenological contours of homelessness, but alters our perception of its causes and character. As for the question of vulnerability, scholars who research family homelessness have shown that children living in hotels or doubled up with others are extremely vulnerable, no less so than those living in congregate shelters. They're often exposed to toxic stress and even acute trauma that can adversely affect physical and emotional health and can be devastating for long-term development. Celeste was determined not to leave the office empty-handed. So she said to the caseworker, all right, so you said that in order to be considered literally homeless, we have to be in a shelter, right? Then me and my kids will go to a shelter. She hadn't wanted to go this route because she had heard horror stories about Atlanta shelters, but she was desperate for anything. The caseworker, though, had more bad news. She said that since Celeste's older son, Jalen, was 14, he wouldn't be able to go with Celeste and Micah and Naya to the women and children's shelter since they didn't allow boys over the age of 13. The only way Celeste could be eligible for assistance, in other words, was if she was willing and able to find other accommodations for Jalen, which she couldn't. And so Celeste left the office with nothing. When she walked outside, the line was just as long as it had been that morning. And in the book, we continue to follow Celeste's journey over the next year and a half through the pandemic breaking out. When she went to clock in at work one day and realized she had been laid off, that's how she found out. Through the relief of finding out her cancer was in remission, even as complications from her treatment continued to cause a host of other health issues. And finally, through the fear and trepidation of having to leave efficiency when she could no longer pay for their room, not knowing where they would be headed next. She shared with me one of her journal entries from around that time, written in her hot pink diary early one morning while her kids were still asleep. God, you know my heart, and I know you promised to never leave me nor forsake me. And I know you say, don't worry, but I'm human, and the nature of my flesh is to do so. So I'm just asking for you to give me the strength to make it through this. It doesn't have to be this way in America. And yet this crisis, it shows no signs of abating. If anything, it's just getting worse and worse. Housing precarity has become an ever-widening sinkhole, swallowing up not only the poor and working class, but vast portions of the downwardly mobile middle class as well. The boundary separating the housed from the unhoused is more permeable than ever. But of course, it's those at the bottom of the income scale, people like the families I write about in this book, who are especially at risk. In the US today, there are just 34 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 low-income households who need them. This amounts to a shortage of 7.3 million apartments, a colossal deficit, and the single greatest reason why so many people are continuing to become homeless. But all this is neither inevitable nor intractable. Ours doesn't have to be a society where people clocking 50 hours, 60 hours a week aren't paid enough to meet their most basic needs, or where parents have to sell their plasma or go without electricity in their homes in order to keep their children housed, or where aging out of the foster care system or being a victim of domestic violence or re-entering society after a period of incarceration should mean that you are unable to have a roof over your head. In the richest country on earth, nobody, whether they work or have a disability or struggle with addiction or mental health issues, should be deprived of stable shelter, period. Making this a reality, however, will require nothing less than a paradigm shift around housing in America. For decades, we've settled for piecemeal, better than nothing initiatives that essentially tweak the existing housing system rather than fundamentally altering it. We've taken it for granted that housing is a commodity, a vehicle for accumulating wealth, and that the few who are lucky enough to own property will invariably profit at the expense of the many, many, many more who need a place to live. Year after year, we've tried to incentivize the private market to fix a debacle created by and large by that very market, whether in the form of housing vouchers or trying to convince private developers to just build more. But at best, these are just incremental remedies, a few affordable apartments here, a handful of supportive housing units there. If this approach to tackling the crisis seems necessary but also insufficient, that's again because the severity and causes and nature of this crisis have been obscured. A narrow view of the problem produces narrow solutions. But when you consider, as I mentioned a moment ago, that the actual number of families and individuals who are unhoused in this country is at least 6 times greater than the official figure, and that's at a moment when homelessness across the country is at an all-time high, and you also consider that nearly 12 million households right now are at risk of becoming homeless themselves, we're confronted with a truly mammoth calamity that requires us to expand our moral and political imaginations. I'd love to talk during the discussion about concrete policy solutions, but right now I want to conclude with the argument that whatever solutions we come up with, they need to be grounded in one guiding principle: the idea that living in a safe, affordable home is not a luxury, but a guaranteed right for everybody. This idea of a right to housing, it's not some radical, outlandish concept. It's actually been a core principle for countless social movements, and it's enshrined in law by many other countries. The right, this is a quote, the right of every family to a decent home was even a major part of FDR's proposed Second Bill of Rights after the Great Depression. A few years later, housing was included alongside food, clothing, and medical care in Article 25 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Recognizing that housing is a basic human right means that we begin to see it as something that's way too precious and important to be left to the whims of the market. In other words, it's not just a cornerstone of human dignity, but an essential public good, something that benefits society as a whole and contributes to the overall flourishing of communities. There are lots of things that we consider public goods, and we find the money to fund accordingly in most cases. K through 12 education, social security, clean water, parks, libraries, roads and highways, and other infrastructure. How have we allowed something as fundamental as shelter to be kept off this list? All across the country, in one city after another, we have extreme and mounting wealth on one side, loss and deprivation on the other, and a credo of hard work will be rewarded, somehow persisting despite it all. But this new American homelessness, it's a choice, one that we've collectively made as a society, and it comes at a cost. I'm thinking of some of the other situations I write about in the book. There's the family of four sleeping in a filthy, freezing storage room after they lose their room at a different extended stay. Or an 8-year-old girl named Grace trying to console her crying baby brother as they pass the night with their mom in their old Toyota. Or those dreadful nights when 3-year-old Sky and her mom were reduced to sleeping outside, terrified in a darkened parking lot. All this suffering is so unnecessary, and it's so utterly preventable. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Eric Martin. Dr. Owens Hofrey and I have been tasked with just responding. And through listening to this, I think the direction I want to go, I want to dwell a little bit in Atlanta, where you're doing a lot of your research, say, kind of link it with the international scene, and then bring it here to LA. What does this have to do with us? And specifically at LMU, try and make it relevant to our experience on campus. But first I had to laugh. David said, I believe you said it would cost $21.7 billion to meaningfully address this issue of homelessness. And then that can be paralyzing, which I maybe laugh is the wrong word. I had to scoff at it, even though it's like a natural response that a lot of people would feel paralyzed at. The first thing I thought of is a couple of years ago it was announced that we're going to spend $1.7 trillion just updating our nuclear arsenal. So I love the title of this book, and thank you so much, Brian. Like, this is amazing. And we're developing a proposal for a new minor at LMU called Wealth and Poverty in Society. And if it comes to fruition, I would love to make this like a bedrock text that would have to be read for that, because these stories are very meaningful. And the title was that there is no place for us. What is there a place for, right? We've decided nationally there is a place for updating our nuclear arsenal at $1.7 trillion. You could just shave off a little bit of that and address homelessness with $21.7 billion. It's easy to point at like Elon Musk or someone like that, be like, well, he could fix it because then we don't have to worry about our responsibility. But what are we spending our money on? Or what are we tolerating people spending money on in our name? I just wanted to mention that that's very feasible, actually. It's a matter of political will. As you said, it's a choice, right? The situation is a choice that we collectively make. So for Atlanta, I was really moved by the personal stories and talking about 7-year-old Micah and how personal this is. I am not from Atlanta. I'm from San Jose, but I have been to Atlanta, specifically to a place called Weelaunee Forest, where Atlanta is building a place called Cop City, which is a mock city so the police can practice taking over cities. They're going to have a Black Hawk helicopter landing pad, places where you can practice setting off bombs, firing ranges. And they're making place for this in their budget. It's going to cost them an estimated $90 million. And they're making place for that. And that money is a choice, right? We want to spend $90 million on this, not on addressing homelessness, not on 7-year-old Micah. Right? So again, it's a choice. It's a matter of political will. In fact, they want to make a place for Cop City so badly that they killed one of the forest defenders out there, Tortuguita. And according to the independent autopsy, Tortuguita was shot upwards of 50 times while in their tents, sitting cross-legged with their hands up, shot by state police. And there's a whole movement to try and occupy the forest so that it cannot be built. And they went in and arrested people for domestic terrorism, simply for being there. Some people were just at a music festival. And I was like, being in this space, I could kind of watch your face while you're naming these names, and I can't remember them all, but it becomes very personal. And just being able to smell the smells, things become personal when you have a face to them. So I'm really grateful that you brought these stories. And I want to link it internationally. I recently was in the West Bank in Palestine, and this issue of who is there a place for there is, I think these are very linked issues, the names you're bringing forward and what's going on in Palestine. I was playing with this 12-year-old named Mazen. We were playing soccer. He beat me in arm wrestling, and we got to meet his little siblings and his parents. And settlers are coming nightly to Mazen's family's area where they live in tents in the West Bank, in their homeland, and intimidating them, pulling out weapons, occasionally firing the weapons. They're trying to drive them off their homes. They already live in tents, but they want to drive them off their homes, right? And so this is a huge issue right now, obviously, in the world. And so I want to name that this is very relevant to the international scene as well and what's going on. And I'd like to briefly bring it back home to LA. Obviously, we have a huge homeless population here. Anybody who's walked down the Venice stretch can see the tents, or really under any overpass can see the tents. And yeah, to use David's word, it can feel paralyzing. Like, what are we supposed to do, you know? But it goes back to the name of the title. What are we making a place for, right? What are we making a place for? Y'all are gonna visit the Catholic worker tomorrow. I'm a theologian, so pardon me for a sec, but they draw upon the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, where Christ self-identifies with the least of these. That which you did for the hungry and the thirsty, you did for me. If you visited those in prison, you visited me, right? They take that seriously. And Dorothy Day talked about Christ rooms. She founded the Catholic worker movement. We need to make Christ rooms for the sacred dwelling in the least of these, the people who are living on the streets, so that they're not living on the streets anymore. Our home will be their home. Our food will be their food. It'll just be one community, right? Crossing these boundaries. It's a beautiful place. And I wonder, I mean, we're here at LMU. This building is huge. Who are we making a place for? Who could we make a place for? Couldn't we have Christ rooms here? Wouldn't that be in keeping with Jesuit values, Catholic values, Christian values, Jesus values? Would that not? And I guess an obvious rebuttal would be like, well, that's not really the mission of a university, right? It's to educate. But think about what kind of education that would give us as a community and what we could learn from that practice of providing hospitality, geographically providing space, making a place, but also importantly, making a place in our budget for this, right? And there's a movement on our campus to get the administration to just reveal even what are we making a place for in our budget. This is really important, right? What are we making a place for? This is a moral issue. And I would say as a theologian, it's a spiritual issue. And what are we making a place for? Are we funding the people who are displacing Mazen, 12-year-old Mazen in the West Bank? We don't know. We are not privy to that information. So even getting the access to the question, what are we making a place for here at LMU in our budget? we don't really know. And I think as people who are part of this community, we should know. And I see all these as intricately linked, right? What's happening in the stories you're telling, what's happening on the West Bank, what's happening here on campus. But importantly, what could happen, right? I don't want to end on a note of despair or anything. Gustavo Gutierrez just died. He's known as the founder of Latin American liberation theology a couple days ago. And he talked in his book about a permanent cultural revolution as the, he unpacks a little bit more than that, but that's what's needed. We need a permanent cultural revolution. And we shouldn't shy away from that language of revolution, right? And it's not like, we all have to be Fidel Castro. It's a cultural revolution. We need to overhaul what we value as a culture. And that means how we spend our money. That means what we do with our space. That means what we make place for in our consciousness and our concerns. And I see the Stop Cop City movement. I see the international solidarity movement with people in the West Bank and Gaza. I see people like Brian in this book all as a linked movement to make a place for all these people. And I see it as a deep sign of hope and part of what Gutierrez called a permanent cultural revolution. I think this is one front, and I really am grateful for this book, and I can't wait to read it. So thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I'd just like to echo Eric's thanks, Brian, for the work that you're doing, the ways in which you shared it with us, especially foregrounding not only stories, but stories about actual people with whom you've built relationship. Because as you said, as you sort of started us out this evening, it can be really easy to fall prey to a kind of analysis paralysis, right? Where we get so overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, the gravity of the social problem, the intersections between them, right? That it's kind of like, all right, we'll just pass through our derbs because, there's just too much, there's too much to do, or pardon me, too much to be done for anything to be done, right? And the invitation that I want to share with you this evening is to resist that temptation. And when you start to fall prey to it, I invite you to engage in an imaginative exercise about what kind of world could be possible if we chose differently. And what resources might there be in the traditions of which we are a part that can guide that imagination and that can guide that action that is so necessary in our contemporary moment. And I'd like to offer a few sort of insights that begin to answer these questions for my own part. So my training is in pastoral theology, and we have this resource of the pastoral circle that is often sort of relegated to social ministries, right? And I want to talk first a little bit about the pastoral circle. I also want to lift up its application by the Society of Jesus locally in collaboration with the Archdiocese of Los Angeles in response to the refugee crisis that was generated during the Salvadoran Civil War in the 1980s, again, here in Los Angeles. And I also want to lift up a current response locally to the threat of homelessness that is enabled by the passage of Senate Bill 4. So I want to start with the pastoral circle, which begins with the kind of social analysis that Dr. Goldstone just did for us, right? That it asks these questions: what is the nature of this social problem? What social, economic, political forces are at work that create it? Right? So we start with social analysis, and then we move toward theological reflection, and we ask, where is God in this? Where might the divine be at work? To what are we called in response to this social problem, in response to the ways in which we've analyzed it? And third, we move toward pastoral planning. What will we do? What will we do in this local community of faith? What will we do in this parish? What will we do in this university? What will we do in this secondary school? What will we do at Catholic Charities, and how will we do it? And the fourth aspect of the pastoral circle is that of insertion, essentially doing it, right? We've made some decisions, we've reflected together, we've decided on things like, here is our plan, and we're actually going to do it. So I want to, again, lift up the example of some members of the Society of Jesus locally who collaborated with lay people here in Los Angeles, as well as entities within the Archdiocese, in response to the influx of Salvadoran refugees as a result of the civil war there. And to just paint with a very broad brush some of the social analysis that was done, then first we're wanting to come to understand the terms of the Salvadoran Civil War. And without getting into all of the specifics or all of what we don't have time for this evening, we can understand the sort of players at work, right? So that the crux of the conflict is between sort of the military that is in El Salvador, that is protecting the interests of the government that has been abusing its power in alliance with the economic interests of the 14 families who owned the vast majority of the means of production in El Salvador in the 1980s. And then on the other side, we have the guerrillas, the leftists, the Farabundo Martí Liberation Front that are advocating essentially through violent means for the needs of the vast majority of Salvadorans who are economically poor, right? So this war is being fought in the early 1980s, and this unrest leads many to flee to the US, even as the US military has trained Salvadoran soldiers in counterinsurgency tactics that are being engaged as a result of this economic poverty. And weaponry is being used that is being bought by our tax dollars in these conflicts to the detriment of the poor and also of religious leaders like Archbishop Romero, like the American church women, like the martyrs of the University of Central America. So these are the terms of the Salvadoran Civil War, right? And the impact that it's beginning to have locally in the Archdiocese as Salvadorans are fleeing in record numbers to the US. And so again, the Society of Jesus in collaboration with lay people, members of what's now a nonprofit called Proyecto Pastoral, are engaging in this theological reflection to ask, where is God in this? Where might God be at work in this context? And to what is the local church called? So to what are we called as a local body? So Dolores Mission, which a parish which many of you, I imagine, are familiar with, and from what I understand, you'll visit those of our guests who are with us, Homeboy Industries, which is another sort of born in the backyard of Dolores Mission Parish and the work that it's doing there. But Dolores Mission is one of the entities that's responding to this influx of Salvadoran refugees, and they're engaging the pastoral circle in the process. So they are offering workshops on Catholic social teaching, which affirms very clearly the right to migrate. They're comunidades eclesiales de base, they're base ecclesial communities, these prayer groups that are reflecting on the gospel in light of their lives, are meeting to reflect on these questions, to what might we be called in light of what we're encountering in our sacred texts. They're listening to Sunday homilies that are being provided by the clergy, and they're actively engaging in a process of communal discernment about whether this community might be called to be a sanctuary church, to provide a space for these refugees who are very much in need. And it's on the 14th of December, 1984, so just 2 days after the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, that Dolores Mission becomes a sanctuary church and starts to engage in this process of pastoral planning in collaboration with La Placita, Our Lady Queen of Angels, the church that's located just up the street from Homeboy, very close to Homeboy, Blessed Sacrament, another parish that was run by the Jesuits in Hollywood, and an Office of Education and Advocacy. And these entities are working together to engage this process of insertion around doing first spiritual accompaniment of those who are seeking refuge, two, acts of direct service, providing beds, seeking language training, job training, right? Getting people in housing that is going to be more long-term than short-term, education, not only about what's happening in El Salvador, but also about what's happening locally, what can be done. And then also this important work of advocacy, talking with local legislators about what can be done, what needs to be changed to make these social problems less urgent, right? So contemporarily, just earlier this year, Senate Bill 4 was passed here in California, which makes it easier for religious groups to use their land for affordable housing. So to convert whatever structures might exist on that property in a way that could be of service to the housing crisis. The Archdiocese of Los Angeles has started a nonprofit, Our Lady Queen of Angels Housing Alliance, which has begun to develop an apartment building near LA City College for community college students and foster children who are over 18 who've aged out of the system, where rent will be just $400 to $500 a month. So you can go to school, you can work the kind of part-time job that many of our students work, and still be able to pay for your own rent while you're while things are getting situated. In response to this issue of working homelessness that you've outlined for us so beautifully. So I just want to invite us to, again, to imagine together what might be possible here in Los Angeles if we were to respond to the reality of economic poverty in such creative ways. As Dr. Martin lifted up, Gustavo Gutierrez just passed away 2 days ago on Tuesday of this week. He's widely regarded as a father of Latin American liberation theology, and he developed this notion of the preferential option for the poor, this notion that God has a special love for those who suffer the brunt of unjust economic structures. So what might it be like if we were to look to the sources within theological discourse, like the pastoral circle, like the preferential option for the poor, to expand our imaginations in response to this reality? Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was an incredibly rich event and conversation. I'm recognizing the time right now is a little past and people have classes they have to get to and other things. So I feel badly that we can't open it up for dialogue, but we will stick around and happy to have good conversation up here. So don't leave if you'd like to continue asking questions, but do feel free to go. But please do join me in thanking our speakers tonight.